I was yanking a catfish off my line when I heard tires crunching up my gravel drive. I turned and saw her Francisca Bloom, HOA president, local menace, and self-declared queen of Pine Lake Shores. She stepped out of her Lexus wearing a wide-brimmed sun hat and a frown so tight it could split granite. "Mr. Elijason," she said, arms crossed like she was posing for a courtroom sketch. "We need to talk, immediately," I sighed. I was still holding the fish, so I let it flop back into the bucket and wiped my hands on my jeans. "What is it this time, Francisca?" I asked. "Grass too green. Cabin too rustic. Boat too floaty." She didn't laugh. She never did. "You're in violation of 17 HOA codes. Your dock is non-compliant, your cabin exceeds the approved footage, and your trash bins are not regulation color. This is your final notice before eviction proceedings begin." I stared at her. "Eviction? From my own cabin?" "Yes," she said, pulling out a manila envelope like it was a dagger. "We've voted. You no longer meet the aesthetic or community standard of Pine Lake Shores. Consider this your formal notice." I took the envelope. "You and your HOA goons don't have jurisdiction here." "We do," she snapped. "You're in our subdivision. You signed the covenants when you bought this place." I chuckled. "Did I?" She blinked. "Of course you did. Everyone does." I didn't say anything. I just turned back toward my cabin, envelope in hand, and walked inside. She yelled something about deadlines and legal action, but I tuned her out. Inside, I opened a drawer, pulled out a thick leather binder, and flipped to the original deed. I'd bought this lakefront cabin 2 years ago from a man named Curtis Weller. He was in his 80s, didn't care for HOAs, and had inherited the land from his father. What Francisca didn't know, because she never bothered to check county records, is that Curtis's father never subdivided the land. He leased it. Long-term leases, technically. When I bought the property, I didn't just get the cabin, I got the rights to the unexpired leaseholds on the entire subdivision, which meant technically, legally. I owned Pine Lake Shores. The HOA didn't own squat. I grinned and picked up my phone. Time to call my attorney, Harold. He was a beast in court and loved when HOAs overstepped. 2 days later, I was served papers by the HOA, claiming I had violated neighborhood codes and was subject to removal by community enforcement. I showed up at the emergency hearing with Harold and the original property deed. Francisca was there with her usual entourage, Paula the secretary, and some guy named Dennis who always looked confused. She strutted in like she was about to win a beauty pageant. Harold leaned over and whispered, "You ready to blow this up?" I nodded. "Let's give the judge a show." The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Judge Ramirez, called us to order. Francisca launched into a monologue about community standards and aesthetic consistency. She had a 3-ring binder full of photos of my cabin, dock, and garbage bins. When she finished, the judge turned to Harold. Harold stood, adjusted his glasses, and dropped the original deed on the desk. "Your Honor," he said calmly, "my client, Jack Elijason, is not in violation of HOA rules. In fact, he is not under HOA jurisdiction at all. Because he owns the land the HOA is built on," Francisca laughed. "That's absurd. He owns 1 cabin." Judge Ramirez flipped through the deed, then she looked up, eyebrows raised. "Miss Bloom," she said, "did you or any member of the Pine Lake Shores HOA ever verify land ownership before enforcing your covenants?" Francisca frowned. "We didn't need to. Everyone signs the agreements." "This deed predates your HOA by over 60 years, the judge said. "The HOA has no legal standing over Mr. Elijason. In fact, it appears you've been collecting dues on land you don't own." Francisca's face turned chalk white. Judge Ramirez continued, "This court finds that the HOA has engaged in unauthorized governance and attempted illegal eviction. Your actions may constitute fraud." That's when the bailiff stepped forward. Francisca didn't say a word as the bailiff stepped forward. Her lips parted like she wanted to object, but no sound came out. Judge Ramirez set the deed aside and turned to the stack of paperwork the HOA had submitted. After flipping through a few pages, she raised her eyes without a hint of hesitation. These documents reference governing authority based on a subdivision charter, she said, but they fail to cite a legal transfer of land rights. Without property jurisdiction, you were operating under false authority. Harold leaned closer to the bench. Your Honor, we'd also like to submit a forensic audit prepared by my client's accountant. It outlines where the HOA dues have gone for the last 14 months. Francesca's head snapped toward us. Her jaw tightened. The judge gestured for the bailiff to take the folder. She read silently for a few moments, then exhaled through her nose without changing expression. Miss Bloom, can you explain the recurring expense labeled Executive Wellness retreat, a monthly charge of over $4,000 with receipts showing luxury spa packages and private transportation? Francesca's voice cracked. Those were team-building exercises necessary for board cohesion. Judge Ramirez gave her a look that suggested she'd heard better excuses from toddlers. Then she turned toward Dennis, who had remained unusually silent. You're listed as treasurer. Did you approve these expenditures? Dennis sat back, blinking rapidly. I just signed what Francesca told me to. I didn't really look at the numbers. Harold didn't wait. Your Honor, we also uncovered that several homeowners, about 30% of the subdivision, had their dues increased without a recorded board vote. The extra funds were funneled into a private account under Miss Bloom's name. Francesca stood suddenly. That's a lie. The judge tapped her gavel once. Sit down, we're not finished. She turned to the bailiff. Notify the county sheriff's office. I want someone from financial crimes here within the hour. Francesca's knees buckled slightly as she lowered herself back into her seat. Paula, who hadn't said a word all morning, suddenly found her own hands very interesting. Judge Ramirez looked toward me. Mr. Elijason, considering your legal ownership of the land, you are within your rights to dissolve any agreements made without your consent. However, I'd advise you to proceed through civil channels to prevent community disruption. I nodded. I intend to. But I'd also like to file a cease and desist against the HOA board for unauthorized use of property and collection of dues. Granted, she said, scribbling something on a form. File with the clerk before you leave. As we exited the courtroom, Harold leaned over. Want to grab lunch? Nothing fuels victory like a greasy cheeseburger. Before I could answer, a deputy intercepted us in the hallway. You Jack Elijason? That's me. He handed me a sealed envelope. You're going to want to read this. County Records Office flagged it this morning after your deed got pulled. I opened it, scanned the contents, and paused. Harold read over my shoulder. It was a copy of a permit request submitted by the HOA 6 months ago seeking approval to demolish 3 lakefront homes and build a private marina. The request listed the properties as vacant land under HOA development rights. One of those addresses was mine. The other 2 belonged to retirees who'd lived there for decades. Harold's eyes narrowed. They were going to take your cabin and build a marina. And pocket the access fees, I said. This wasn't about trash bins or docks. They wanted the shoreline. We walked back to my truck in silence. I could already feel the fire under my ribs starting to burn. Francesca hadn't just overstepped, she'd built an entire scheme on land she didn't own. Back at the lake, I stopped at my neighbor's place, Earl, a Vietnam vet with a temper like a lit fuse and a face that looked like it had argued with a lawnmower. He was on his porch sharpening a hunting knife when I approached. Jack, he said without looking up. Heard you went to war with the paper tyrants. That why Francesca sped past here earlier looking like she saw the devil. They tried to evict me. Turns out I own the land. Earl finally looked up. You're serious? I've got the deed. And Francesca's been using fake permits to seize shoreline. Yours is probably next. He stood slowly, wiped the blade on a rag and nodded once. Then it's time to knock the termites out of the walls. By sunset, word had spread. I didn't need to call a meeting, people just started showing up at my cabin. Fishing buddies, retirees, weekend hikers, locals who'd been pushed around by Francesca and her clipboard for years. One by one, they came with questions, stories, and ledgers of ridiculous fines and fake violations. A nurse named Talia brought a folder of letters. She'd gotten threatening legal action if she didn't remove the wind chimes from her porch. A single mom named Rena described how her child's sidewalk chalk had been labeled graffiti. One man, George, said Francesca had demanded he cut down a sapling because it interfered with the neighborhood's visual rhythm. Harold helped me set up a table with copies of the deed, the original lease agreements, and the HOA's fraudulent filings. Each neighbor signed a petition supporting the immediate suspension of the HOA's operations. We weren't just angry, we were organized. The next morning, I filed a motion for an emergency injunction. With Harold's help, we attached over 20 sworn affidavits from residents citing fraudulent fines, embezzlement, and threats of eviction. The county courthouse scheduled a hearing within 72 hours, but Francesca wasn't done. That afternoon, I caught a black SUV idling near my dock. A man in a polo shirt was walking the perimeter with a clipboard. When I approached, he turned and flashed a badge from some private security firm I'd never heard of. "I'm conducting a compliance inspection," he said flatly. "On behalf of who?" Pine Lake Shores HOA. I stepped between him and the shoreline. "They no longer have legal authority to inspect anything." He didn't argue, just turned, got back in the SUV, and drove off without a word. That night, I installed motion-activated floodlights and 2 new trail cameras facing the road. I wasn't taking chances. The morning of the hearing, I arrived early. The courtroom was packed, more than 50 residents in attendance, some standing, others seated along the walls. Francesca walked in 10 minutes late, flanked by a new attorney who looked like he'd been hired off a billboard. Judge Ramirez didn't waste time. "This court has reviewed the new evidence submitted by Mr. Elijason and co-petitioners. The fraudulent permit applications alone warrant immediate investigation by the district attorney's office." She turned to Francesca's new lawyer. "Do you have anything to say in your client's defense?" He stood, shuffled a few papers, and cleared his throat. "Given the mounting evidence, we request a continuance to prepare a revised response." "Denied," the judge said. "Effective immediately, the Pine Lake Shores HOA is suspended from all operations pending a full audit. A temporary receiver will be appointed to manage community matters until a new board is elected." Francesca's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her attorney whispered something to her, and her expression collapsed into the realization that she'd just lost everything she controlled. The judge looked down at the final order. "And Mr. Elijason, as the legal landholder, you are reinstated as custodian of all existing agreements. You may proceed to re-establish property terms under your discretion." As the gavel fell, the room erupted not in cheers, but in the quiet, satisfied murmurs of people who'd finally seen the end of a long, bitter reign. Outside the courthouse, Earl clapped me on the shoulder. "You didn't just win a case, Jack. You gave this neighborhood its spine back." I nodded. "Now let's clean up the mess they left behind." The following week was a whirlwind. The court-appointed receiver, a no-nonsense former city planner named Lena Morrison, arrived on a Wednesday morning. She wore a faded utility vest, carried a leather-bound ledger under her arm, and wasted no time stepping into what remained of the HOA's gutted shell. By noon, she had changed every lock on the community center, disabled the HOA's email accounts, and posted a public notice on the bulletin board outside the general store declaring the HOA under formal restructuring. I watched from the porch of the cabin with a fresh cup of coffee as Lena directed a team of auditors through boxes of shredded documents that had been dumped in the dumpster behind the HOA office. She caught me looking and called out, "You got a minute?" I walked over and met her by the sidewalk, where she was leafing through a torn binder labeled Board Minutes 2022. "Tell me straight," she said, not looking up. "You know if any of this stuff was altered?" "I know at least a dozen residents who were fined for things that don't appear anywhere in the HOA bylaws." And I'd bet my last fishing rod the board never held proper elections after the original founders moved out. Then we're going to need sworn statements. As many as you can gather. Fraudulent enforcement of governance is civil. But if they forged documents or faked meeting records to justify financial decisions, then this heads into criminal territory. I nodded. You'll have them by Friday. She handed me a flash drive. Copy anything you've got. Emails, notices, screenshots. Especially anything with signatures. Back at the cabin, I pulled out the crate of files I'd started collecting the day after the hearing. Some were mine. Most had been dropped off by neighbors who were tired of feeling powerless. There were letters with suspiciously identical wording, fines that escalated without warning, and a spreadsheet from George showing his dues had increased 3 times in 1 year without a single vote. I stayed up until 2 in the morning scanning and organizing. Talia had emailed over a timeline of every warning she'd received for non-conforming property decor with photographic timestamps to match. Rena contributed copies of every threatening letter she'd gotten over the chalk drawings. But the real jackpot came from Dennis. He showed up at my door the next morning, holding a cardboard box and looking like he hadn't slept in days. I didn't know, he said, without waiting for me to offer him a seat. She told us everything was above board, I just signed the checks. I never saw the real books. What changed? She called me last night, said she was leaving town, told me if anyone asked I was to say I'd handled all the finances, that I made the decisions. I stepped aside and let him in. He set the box on the table and opened it. Inside were 2 black ledger books, both labeled Operating Fund. She kept one in the HOA office. This is the other, the real one. It was worse than I expected. There were entries for cash withdrawals labeled consulting, but the receipts were personal shopping trips, luxury car rentals, and once, a ski vacation to Aspen. Dozens of checks had been written to a company called Bloom Solutions LLC, registered out of state under Francesca's name. I called Lena. She picked up on the first ring. You're going to want to see this in person. She arrived 20 minutes later with a deputy and a woman from the county's Financial Crimes Division. By the time they left, Dennis had given a full statement and the ledgers were in evidence bags. The following Monday, Francesca Bloom was arrested at the regional airport trying to board a private plane using a passport under her maiden name. She had dyed her hair and was carrying a suitcase stuffed with cash, jewelry, and a burner phone. The arrest made the local news by that evening, and by dawn, it had been picked up by 2 national outlets. The charges included embezzlement, wire fraud, document forgery, and attempted unlawful seizure of private property. The sheriff's office confirmed she'd diverted over $200,000 from the HOA account over the course of 18 months. When the sheriff gave the press conference, he made it clear, this wasn't just mismanagement. This was a deliberate, calculated effort to exploit homeowners for personal gain. I didn't celebrate, not yet, the damage was still fresh, but people started stopping by the cabin just to say thanks. One by one they brought things. A pie, a 6-pack of home brew, a basket of fresh caught trout. It wasn't about the gifts, it was about the shift. The fear was gone by the end of the month. Lena had dissolved the HOA's remaining assets and froze every bank account associated with the board. Residents were no longer required to pay dues, and a new community council was being formed, voluntary, transparent, and advisory only. At the first public meeting, I stood in the back, arms crossed as Lena addressed the crowd. We're going to do this differently, she said. No more fines. No more secret meetings. If someone wants to plant a flamingo in their yard or paint their door red, that's their decision. You're adults. You live here. You should get to decide how. Applause broke out, not wild but firm, earnest. People clapped because they meant it. After the meeting, Earl approached, carrying a worn notebook under one arm. Got an idea for a community cleanup, he said. Figure we start by clearing that old trail down by the creek. Used to be a nice spot to walk. Been overgrown since before Francesca. Sounds good, I said. "I'll bring the chainsaw," he nodded once. "Glad you stuck it out, most would have folded. I didn't do it alone. You didn't have to, you just had to be the first one who said enough." That night, I sat on the porch with a lantern burning low and the lake stretching silent under the stars. The water lapped against the posts of the dock, soft and steady. The cameras stayed up, but I didn't watch them as often anymore. The cabin was mine. The land was mine. But more importantly, the people who lived here had taken it back, not just from Francesca, but from the fear she built. A week later, Lena dropped by with a formal letter from the county. "The subdivision's title has been amended," she said, handing it over. "You are now listed as the primary holder of the land beneath Pine Lake shores. All prior claims by the HOA are officially nullified." I unfolded the document, feeling the weight of it settle into my bones. "I don't want to control it," I said. "I just want to make sure no one ever tries to again." "Then make that your legacy," she said. "Build something better." I looked around at the cabins, the trees, the gravel roads that twisted through the pines like veins. We already are. The first real test came 3 weeks after the court ruling, when a letter arrived addressed to the Office of Property Management, Pine Lake Shores. It wasn't meant for me, but postmarked to the old HOA address, and the mail carrier had dropped it at my cabin now that I held the land title. Inside was a notice from a private development firm, Mariner Ridge Holdings, confirming a scheduled site inspection for a Phase 1 parcel review of the lakeside properties. No attachments. No proposed plans. Just a date, a time, and a rep's name, Kyle Denshaw. I didn't like it. I hiked over to where the old HOA office used to be, now locked up and stripped bare. The property had been cleared of Francesca's vanity signage, but a few unopened boxes still sat inside near the front window. Lena had mentioned they were waiting on a proper records archivist before touching them. I called her from the porch. "This name ring any bells?" I asked, reading her the letter word for word. She paused. "I saw something about Mariner Ridge in the budget ledgers. Francesca authorized a consulting fee to them last year. No invoices attached. Think she was trying to sell the land, not legally. But if she convinced them she had authority and they moved money already, there's a chance someone's still trying to push it through." I folded the letter and slid it into my coat. "I'll handle it." "No. This time we do it by the book." The next day, Lena arrived with 2 investigators from the state attorney's office. They were polite, but efficient. One took the letter and began scanning the HOA's archived emails on a laptop. The other asked to review any property-related contracts in my possession. I handed over what I had and they got to work. Meanwhile, I spent that afternoon walking the trail behind the lake, where the trees grew thick and the slope dipped into a quiet hollow. The air smelled of damp pine and earth. I remembered Curtis, the man who sold me the cabin, once saying this part of the land had bad bones for development. Too much water under the soil. Foundations would buckle. You'd spend more filling than building. But I also remembered the old boundary markers he showed me. Stakes with faded red paint buried beside the tree roots. I found one, then another. Every single one lined up with the parcels listed on the inspection letter. That night, the state investigators called back. "Found what we needed," the taller one said when I met them outside the lodge. 6 months ago, Francesca signed a letter of intent to sell development rights to Mariner Ridge. She forged a notary seal and fabricated a board vote, both traceable. It's enough for a formal charge. Do they still think the deal's alive? They're scheduled to show up tomorrow morning. "Want us to be here?" "No," I said. "Let them come, I'll be waiting." At sunrise, I pulled out a folding chair and set it at the edge of the gravel loop near the lakefront. The fog lifted slowly, curling off the water like steam. Around 9, a black SUV rolled up and parked just past the main trail. Out stepped a man in a blue sport coat with a clipboard and a phone in his hand. He looked around, clearly expecting someone else to receive him. "You Kyle Denshaw?" I asked. He turned confused. "Yes." "I'm here for the parcel review on behalf of Mariner Ridge. This is private land." "Correct," I said. "It's mine." He blinked. I'm sorry. The parcels you're here to inspect fall under a tract I own. The HOA had no authority to negotiate a deal with you. He hesitated, glancing at his clipboard. Our agreement is with the Pine Lake Shores HOA. That HOA no longer exists. It was dissolved after a court ruling. I have the deed. You're trespassing? He checked his phone, then looked back at me. We were told the land was cleared for rezoning. I reached into my coat and handed him a certified copy of the court order. No rezoning has been granted, and your contract is based on forged documentation. The state attorney has copies. You may want to call your legal team. He stood there, jaw tight, one hand still gripping his phone. We've already invested in preliminary surveys. If this goes to litigation, it won't, I said, because you'll walk, or you'll get tied up in a fraud case. Your call. He stood there another moment, then turned and walked back to the SUV without another word. By evening, Lena confirmed Mariner Ridge had officially withdrawn their interest. The state's investigation had expanded. They were now building a case for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, based on emails between Francesca and a man listed as an acquisitions partner at the firm. Apparently, she had promised him exclusive lake access for his vacation home in exchange for a silent stake in the development. They'd even drafted plans for a private helipad. The charges were stacking up. A month later, I sat in the back row of the county courthouse as Francesca Bloom appeared for her preliminary hearing. She wore a gray blazer and no makeup. Her hair was flat, her demeanor muted. She didn't make eye contact with anyone in the room. The judge read the charges: financial fraud, forgery, unlawful misrepresentation of authority, and attempted sale of property without ownership. Then the state attorney added a final count: conspiracy to defraud through interstate communications. Francesca pled not guilty. The judge denied bail, citing flight risk. When the gavel dropped, she was escorted out in cuffs. Afterward, I joined the others outside. Talia stood with Rena, both holding copies of their formal restitution claims. Earl leaned against the hood of his truck, arms folded, watching the courthouse doors. You believe it now? I asked. He nodded slowly. I believe people like her never think they'll lose, but when they do, they fall harder than the rest. The county issued an official report 2 weeks later. It detailed every violation committed by the HOA over the past 5 years. Misappropriated funds, fabricated fines, illegal liens on properties, all of it laid bare. The report concluded with a recommendation. No future HOA or private governing body would be permitted jurisdiction over Pine Lake Shores without a unanimous vote from every property leaseholder, which meant, effectively, never. By early fall, the community council was up and running. Entirely volunteer, no power to fine or regulate, just neighbors coordinating maintenance and seasonal events. I sat in on a few meetings, mostly to listen. People talked about trail cleanups, lake safety, and a fall festival for the kids. Not a single mention of paint colors, mailbox styles, or grass height. One afternoon, I found Dennis sanding down the old HOA sign out behind the lodge. It had been dumped there after the locks were changed, the letters still half visible through the peeling paint. You want it gone? He asked. Burn it, I said. Let the fire take it. He nodded and fed it into the fire pit. The flames caught quickly and the wood hissed as it burned. Someone poured coffee and someone else started a story about the time Francesca fined them for leaving their canoe tied up too long. Laughter followed, not bitter but honest. Cleansing, that night back at the cabin, I opened the ledger Curtis had given me when I bought the place. Inside were notes, handwritten entries about the land, its quirks, its people. One page caught my eye: land doesn't need kings, just caretakers. Keep it simple, keep it honest. I closed the book and set it down. The lake was quiet again, not just in sound but in spirit. The fear was gone. The control was gone. What remained was what should have been there all along: peace, ownership, community. And for the first time in a long time, Pine Lake Shores was